Hello interwebs, today we're going to be doing something brand new that I've actually never done on this channel, which is saying something because I've done everything. Like, everything. Did I get that? Did I time that? I feel like I didn't time that wink right. I was like, I did everything. Anyway, but regardless of that, yes, today I'm going to be doing something brand new that I've never done before, and that is a tier ranking. Specifically, a tier ranking of all the MCU Marvel projects that have been released so far. So that includes all the TV shows, not just the Disney Plus ones, but the Netflix ones, the ones released on Hulu, the ones released on other networks and things like that, like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Agent Carter, stuff like that, as well as all the MCU movies. Now, and just so people who may be watching this in the future, I'm doing this ranking list just after the release of Loki about a week or so ago, wrapped up its run on Disney Plus. So we have Black Widow, we have Loki. The next big sort of Marvel project, I believe, is What If, and then Shang-Chi on the movie side as well. So those haven't been released yet, and I'll add them to the tier list at some point down the road when we sort of redo this at some point. But that's where we are right now on the rank list. So let's dive in. This is probably going to be a little bit controversial, but it hopefully will be a little bit of fun because, like I said, never done it before. So let's dive in. Also, apologies that my video is like facing the opposite way from this ranking list. I tried doing a flip flop of it, and I tried rearranging this image like a billion times, and I could not for some reason get it to work structurally. So apologies that I'm gonna be looking this way, even though the tier rank is technically on your screen that way. So you're just gonna have to live with it. We're gonna get through it together. Alrighty, so first up we have Jessica Jones, and I kind of knew going into this rank list that it was going to be difficult with TV shows, because especially the Netflix TV shows in particular, because they're TV shows, they oscillate in quality throughout them, within them, so much that it's going to be like, well, how do I judge it? Do I judge it on their highs? Do I judge it on like their like worst season, or do I just try and judge it as a whole? And I have to say, I really think with TV shows, I just have to judge them on their totality. So with Jessica Jones, right, the first season of that show with David Tennant as the Purple Man is so fantastic. And then season 3 is really, really good as well. It's not at the level of season 1, but season 3, the villain was really good. The development of Jessica Jones's character is really awesome. Season 2, though, really dragged for me, and I like the development of Jessica Jones's character, but everyone was just so frustrating in that season, like really, just like all the side characters in that. Especially, I'm blanking on her name, but Jessica Jones' like best friend becomes such a jerk in season 2, and she's worse in season 3, but at least works for her character a little bit more. So like this show averages out, I feel like, to be a solid B, but I would put season 1 in definitely A or S tier, but I think overall this show, Jessica Jones, averages out to be a B tier. But I love Jessica, and I would love to see her come back. I think she's a great hero, and I would honestly love to see more of the MCU. So hopefully she'll be able to get a return, along with another hero we're going to talk about on this list in just a little bit. I feel like it's going to be better, even though I just did Jessica Jones, I feel like it's going to be better if I go through this chronologically. So I'll leave Jessica Jones on the board as sort of like a tone setter for this piece. But for now, I'm going to try and go sort of as chronologically as I can remember through these movies. So first up, we're going to have, or second up, I should say, after Jessica Jones, we're going to do Iron Man, the very first Iron Man. This is actually going to be really difficult, and I may move things around here, but I really like the very first Iron Man. I think it's a really good tone setter for the MCU. I think it works really, really well as setting like what this is. It like clearly redefined what superhero movies could be in a summer that like The Dark Knight was also coming out at. Especially with that ending with Tony Stark saying, "I am Iron Man." Just like I remember setting my mind ablaze about what the next movies in this universe are going to be, and I didn't even realize that like a movie universe is going to be a possibility really at this point. So this I'm gonna put Iron Man as A tier, because I do think while I love that movie, Ironmonger is kind of a blah villain, and it has only gotten worse over time, just because he's become like one of like many Tony Stark people who have a revenge against Tony Stark villains. So Ironmonger, kind of disappointing. Overall, though, a phenomenal movie that might go in. I could argue we'll see where it ranks against other stuff in the end, and maybe I'll push it up, but it's going in the A tier. All right, next up we have The Incredible Hulk with Edward Norton. I think this movie kind of gets a bad rap by a lot of people. I think it's actually much better than people think it is. Ed Norton, I think, does a really good job of like kind of bringing that sort of like anger, but like controlled rage to Banner that really comes across, and I think he does better than I think any real other Bruce Banner, even Mark Ruffalo, I think doesn't get across that like controlled rage that Edward Norton does so well in this movie. So I think there's that to be said. The rest of the plot though is kind of blah, but it did add Thunderbolt Ross and also Abomination. We're gonna get back in Shang-Chi, so those are worth saying. But ultimately, I'm gonna say this is a C. Edward Norton elevates it a little bit, but ultimately, I think a C in my book. Next up, we have Iron Man 2. This is this is like the first, even though it's only the third movie I think in the MCU, it's kind of like the first Marvel movie that really felt like it was trying to do other things and was much less caring about what the actual movie itself was. Like, this was setting up, it was setting up Black Widow. It was setting up, like other stuff coming for the Avengers, Shield and Nick Fury and things like that. And it ultimately kind of feels like a little bit bogged down by trying to do other things. And it won't be the only Marvel project in that sort of setting here, and to have that issue where it's sort of like trying to set up other things. But ultimately, I think that I think it does have a good villain that ultimately gets wasted in Whiplash. And then I also really love Sam Rockwell. Sam Rockwell also elevates this as a really, really fun villain as well. But Mickey Rourke, I think, does also, most people don't talk about him, but he's really solid. I might push this down, but I feel like I'm debating between a B and a C here. I'm going to give it a C, but I'm going to put it above Incredible Hulk. And maybe I'll push it to a B tier when all is said and done. We'll sort of do a reassess at the end of this video just to make sure everything's where I want it to be. Then we have the very first Thor movie. Ooh, okay, so I really like the very first Thor movie. I think it has that Shakespearean gravitas to it. They hadn't really figured out how to use Chris Hemsworth yet. I think Chris Hemsworth is a much stronger comedic actor, but here I think he does give a really strong performance, and everything on Asgard I think is honestly really solid. Tom Hiddleston's first turn as Loki, phenomenal. But everything on Earth, on Midgar, as they would say, meh. Kind of don't care all that much. There's a couple good humorous scenes where you kind of get hints of what Chris Hemsworth will eventually become in terms of his comedic abilities, but overall I think it's not as great. So I'm gonna give this one, I'm gonna give it a solid B overall. Next up, we have Captain America: The First Avenger. I love this movie. I will stand by this movie all day. I think it perfectly sets the stage for Steve Rogers. Red Skull, while a bit like over-the-top Nazi villain, I mean, it was just literally a Nazi and not much more beyond that. I think the performance is well done for him. Clearly we got Agent Smith, Elrond himself doing his wonderful job to bring a lot to that role. This really set the stage for the rest of the MCU in a different way than I think Iron Man 2 kind of bungled, in that like you really get a sense of like the larger universe that's being built here with Captain America, with the Tesseract, with Hydra, stuff like that. But it doesn't feel like it's distracting from the movie overall like Iron Man 2's was. And also just Chris Evans' performance leads the way. I'm going to give this one an A. Again, it could be knocked down to a B. I could see it being argued. We'll do a reassess, but I think it's going to be an A. Next up, we have the first Avengers movie, what it was all building towards then, and how, like, we all thought that this was the shit when it came out, right? And like, I remember thinking, like, oh, this is gonna be the coolest thing ever, and now, like, in a world post-End Game, I'm like, come on, this is small potatoes. But I remember at the time, this was so cool. But I think looking back on it and sort of reassessing it in an age of sort of, like, being more aware in myself and more aware of what's going behind the camera of things, Joss Whedon as well, and sort of like looking at some of the tropes that Joss Whedon brings to it. I think this movie goes down a little bit more in my estimation in terms of its treatment of Black Widow and some things that happened there. I think a lot of the stuff that was really novel in this movie, like the quippy witticisms, have kind of gotten to like bog the rest of the MCU down, but it was still worthwhile here as well. So I'm going to... This might be my most controversial pick here. But I will say the character interactions are phenomenal in this. And, like, I think that works. I'm going to give it an A, but it's a soft A. Could put it down. I'm going to give it a soft A, but it's at the bottom of the A's. So it's a low A Avengers movie. All right, so I might bungle some of the order here, but I believe next up was Thor: The Dark World? We'll go with Thor the Dark World. It might not have been the next direct one, but we'll go with Thor the Dark World. So Thor the Dark World is up next. This is definitely lower tier, the Marvel movie. Chris Hemsworth gets a little bit of fun stuff to do. There's a couple good moments. I think Tom Hiddleston actually, I think, has some breakout moments throughout the film. The portal stuff towards the end of the movie is also really great, but the villain just is boring. Most of the plot is boring. Everything on Earth is boring. So ultimately, I think this has got to be the first D tier. But there's some stuff salvaging here, and ultimately this movie, after Endgame and a few other things, becomes some of the most important stuff in the MCU, surprisingly enough. But yeah, I think mostly this movie is definitely a D tier. But it's not a complete wash, as I think many people would give it. Okay, so then this is where we're going to toss in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., even though I kind of know Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. goes throughout most of this series run. So I'll be honest, I have not seen all of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I think I saw the first 2 seasons fully, and then I've kept up with the story of it, and I've seen bits and pieces of it overall, so I could throw this in unseen, but this is a tier ranking list, my tier ranking list, so I ultimately might be doing this a bit of a disservice in the long run of things, but I think I've got at least a good taste of the overall show, but I have not seen every single episode, so I'll be honest about that. I feel like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., judging again like on the Jessica Jones standard of the whole series, I think it's a solid B, but a low B, because I feel like this show really was novel when it first came out, but in the world like post Arrowverse, post like so many other shows that have like done the superhero thing on sort of a lower budget tier that this show does, I feel like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. novelty has kind of worn off, and in that I feel like it just kind of becomes like a solid show, but nothing spectacular. Like great character interactions, a lot of fun, some intriguing storylines, but ultimately don't really feel like very weighty in the terms of the other MCU stuff, and ultimately kind of feels just very ancillary and very much trying to play keep up with the MCU in the way that like other shows didn't, that felt a little bit more like they could do their own thing within their own worlds, like the Netflix shows did, despite their own problems that the Netflix shows had. But I felt like they at least had their own world, whereas Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is very much trying to be like, we're part of the MCU, but never really getting there. And ultimately not really feeling super novel within that post like Arrowverse, and now post the Disney Plus shows feel much more impactful. So I'm gonna give it a solid B. But overall, I think you could argue it deserves more than it got. You could also say it deserves less. So putting it at the B. On that note, let's do a little bit of a TV detour. So we'll go to Daredevil now. Again, we're sort of grading on the curve. It's got 3 seasons. This one, I think this one doesn't always reach the heights of Jessica Jones season 1, but is much more consistent. Probably the most consistent MCU show on Netflix. I think season 2 is definitely where the dip happens, like Jessica Jones, but its dip is not as strong as Jessica Jones' season 2. And I think season 3, is phenomenal. Kingpin, fantastic villain throughout the entire series. There are some discussions to be had about, I think it's like Perlmutter, when you were talking about the Netflix show. I think it was Perlmutter. I might be getting the executive wrong, but some stuff that like was kind of skeevy in terms of the Asian representation in the show, and how they really did not want to center Asian representation, and despite the writers and the actors and everyone being on board for it, but the Perlmutter not wanting that, which is deeply skeevy and frustrating. Again, it might not be Perlmutter, but I believe it is, and Perlmutter deserves credit for other terrible things as well, despite that. But I really think that the show ultimately is an A. I think season 1 and season 3, fantastic. There's some stuff that is kind of frustrating, especially season 2, and especially the stuff in terms of some representation issues. But overall, I think the show is a consistent A. Even though I think Jessica Jones season 1 would overall be like S tier for me, I think it pushes down, whereas I think Daredevil just is solid A all the way throughout. Let's keep going down the Netflix hole, and we'll talk about Luke Cage. Luke Cage, I think, is the one. Jessica Jones and Daredevil have this problem too, but Luke Cage, I think, is really the show that makes you really feel it in terms of the Netflix pacing problem. The Netflix Marvel shows were just too long each season. 13 episodes, I think, is too much for the story that they always had for these shows. I feel like they would have been much stronger doing the Disney Plus route is doing now, with like 6 to 8, maybe 10 on the outside episodes. And Luke Cage, I think, is the worst offender of this. It feels, each season just feels too long, and I just start to get bored in the middle of them. Season 1, I thought was good and kind of has a surprising twist in the middle of it in terms of the villain change, but the second villain I find less interesting than the first villain, so it's got some shock value. I think I'm blanking on his name, but the actor who plays Luke Cage is fantastic. I think he's perfect as Luke Cage, and I love his appearances in everything that he's in as the character, but ultimately some weird storytelling choices that are interesting, but ultimately not as paying off as well. The pacing issues within this, season 2 being a lot more boring than season 1, but still not all that bad. I think gives this a solid C, but an upper C. So this is a high C show, as opposed to like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. the thing is like a low B. But I do think Luke Cage has moments of greatness. It just doesn't really ever break into like, oh, fantastic. Whereas like I think Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. does have a few of those like, oh, that's really cool moments that Luke Cage never hits. Next up, let's sort of finish out the Netflix shows. So we got Iron Fist. We're gonna put this at a D. This show is so bad in its first season. It just did not know what it was trying to say, what it was trying to do. Is very much like, oh, look, rich boy trying to do, cultural appropriation and beat up people in a way that was not as interesting as someone like Bruce Wayne as a character is, or other like sort of billionaire superhero characters can be, even though I'm not a big fan of billionaire superhero characters overall. Iron Fist is definitely the least interesting of them. And season 2, I think, does a little bit better in that season, where you get to start to see a little bit more of the building out of the ancillary cast and less focus on Iron Fist himself, which I think was a smart move because he's clearly the least interesting character. So it starts to redeem itself a little bit towards the end there, and definitely showed signs of improvement. And I would have been interested in a possible season 3 if they had ever gotten the chance to do it. But ultimately, given what we've got, it's a D. It's got to be a D. And this brings us ultimately, of course, to Defenders. Defenders, a show that had so much more potential than it ever got to use. The story is so bad and bland and boring. I feel like such a waste of Sigourney Weaver as a character. And even weirdly, despite what I was saying earlier, despite this only having 6 episodes, I also still felt the pacing problem. It felt too long for the story it had, and the story it had wasn't all that interesting. That being said, I'm going to give it a low C. I'm going to put it below Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but putting it in a B. Sorry, putting it in a B. No, I'm gonna put it in a C above Luke Cage. But I think the reason that I like it, and I think I'm going to give it a little bit of tier higher, is because I do like the interactions between the characters. I do like the moments that they have between each other. Specifically, like Jessica Jones and Luke Cage have some good moments. Luke Cage and Iron Fist have some good moments together. Jessica Jones and Daredevil have some good moments together. The episode where they're all at the Chinese restaurant sort of eating food together and talking things out was a lot of fun. The cinematography of this is fantastic. I love how they color code each character's, like each scene with that's focusing on a specific character. It has a different color scheme, and when the characters mix, those colors all come together. So the filmmaking of this show is actually incredibly on point. So there is some really good stuff within here. It's just not the plot or the villains or anything besides the main characters in the cinematography, to be honest. So high C, but such a waste of potential. But it had its moments. And let's just say screw it. We're gonna do The Punisher. Just finish off all the Netflix shows here. Punisher. John Bernthal, perfect choice for this character. He did such a phenomenal job of Daredevil Season 2. Best thing about that season, by the way, Daredevil Season 2, I think, is the low point for that show. But John Bernthal makes it worth every second that he's on screen. And when he went off into his own show, less interesting. Punisher is a character that I don't think as interesting as like on paper he could be. He just kind of feels bland, but I think John Bernthal brings that energy to him. So I think a lot of the Punisher show really rests on him as the character, and I think he does a great job, but the plot never justifies him. The villain of season 1, I forget his name, he comes back in season 2. He's interesting, but he doesn't get interesting enough until too late. Like later on in the show, he becomes very interesting, and then in season 2, he just becomes very bland. And even less interesting than he was in season 1. So ultimately, I'm going to give this show, I'm going to put it below Luke Cage. Well, no, it's going to go below Iron Man 2. It's a show that I like on the back of John Bernthal, but ultimately, it's not something I ever really want to rewatch. All right, let's get back to the MCU proper and talk about Iron Man 3. Iron Man 3. I think this movie is deeply underrated. I think it does such a great job with building up Tony Stark's PTSD. I think it really makes you feel the benefit of doing MCU movies like this and having him sort of deal with the weight and pressure of the Avengers movie and what happened to him there, and the sort of coming anticipation that we have for everything else that's going to come with Thanos and Infinity War. I think this movie really builds it up well. I think the ideas of this film are really interesting with the Mandarin villain twist, and sort of that whole thing. But they sort of, again, it's one of those problems that the MCU does a couple times where like they have a twist villain and the twist villain is less interesting than the villain they had set up. But ultimately, I like the thematic use of the villain and what it means for like cultural appropriation, sort of creating narratives to try and, do these things in this world, the millionaires sort of pitting people against each other. I think there's actually a strong message here within this movie that I think gets paid off well with Tony Stark saying, I'm going to throw away my Iron Man suits. And then, unfortunately, it kind of subverts the whole purpose of the MCU later on in the fact that that ending just has no weight later on in the MCU because we see Tony Stark clearly having Iron Man suits after that point. And so it feels weird because this movie feels like it's such a perfect utilization of what the MCU is in terms of feeling anticipation for what's coming and also building off of what came before in terms of the character motivation and where it takes him and consequences for all that stuff. But then ultimately in and of itself as a film becomes consequenceless. So it's just that weird thing. So again, I'm going to put this as a B, above Thor but below Jessica Jones, because of that choice. I think if this movie had more weight, if like Tony Stark's suits had been destroyed and stayed that way, and we really had dealt with the ramifications of that in future movies, this movie might have gone up higher in my estimation. But ultimately, the bland villain and the lack of consequences for a movie that could have had more consequences makes this a B, a solid B. Captain America and the Winter Soldier. Okay, so this is where probably going to be one of my hot takes movies. Everyone loves this movie. I am less hot on it, mostly because I just never was a big Steve Bucky fan. I've come to like Bucky a little bit more after Falcon and the Winter Soldier, even though I don't love that show overall. I like Bucky as a character more now than I ever did before. But within this, I was never invested in the Bucky-Steve relationship all that much. I was more invested in the Peggy Steve stuff, and not to say like I shipped Steve and Bucky. The amount of weight, the emotional weight that this movie tries to earn out of that relationship, and also in Civil War as well, just doesn't work for me as well. I think some of the ideas in this are interesting of like not trusting the sort of like America, we can, using S.H.I.E.L.D. as a stand-in for America, and American idealism is like, we can go, which is always a problem with, like, we're never able to critique the United States within the MCU as directly as we should be able to, but what are you going to do? Anyways, the idea of, like, the fact of America being, like, world police and Captain America, Steve, having problems with that, that's interesting. Making them all Nazis, well, again, there is some resonance with, like, the infiltration of Nazism and fascism into the United States is interesting. Having it be, like, an outside force, I think it does disservice to it. I think it just been straight up, like, they built Hydra within itself because that's what they wanted to do, as opposed to Hydra coming in, I think would have been more interesting of a choice. And so, ultimately, I'm less hot on this movie as other people. Though I do find it to have interesting moments, and I always love my boy Steve. He's my favorite character in the MCU, or at least one of my favorite Avengers in the MCU, I should say. I like Nebula and Loki a lot more as characters, but he's my favorite Avenger. But I'm gonna put him in a B. I know that might be the most controversial pick, I think, on this list, because I think other people would put this movie higher. I enjoy it, but I don't hold it as much in the same esteem as others. But the elevator fight, that is magnificent and deserves every moment. But this brings us to Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know if this is exactly where it came out. It might be a different place, but I'm going to put it here. Easy. I already know where this is going to go. S rank. S rank. I love this movie. Guardians of the Galaxy. James Gunn is one of my favorite filmmakers. I'm so excited for his upcoming The Suicide Squad movie. I adore him. He did such a great job taking the characters that no one really heard about, other than comic book fans, and really just doing something unique and new even within the MCU. It has such a strong tone, vibrancy. The characters are all wonderful, bounce off each other so well. The visuals of this movie are fantastic. The soundtrack is awesome. The character weight is awesome. Rocket Raccoon is such a great character. Drax is this movie is just phenomenal. Just phenomenal. It might be hard to topple this movie as my favorite movie in the MCU. We'll see what comes up as we go within this list. But right now, S tier, and it will be hard to knock this out of number one because I love Guardians of the Galaxy. All right, let's do Agent Carter. Agent Carter is a great show. Another one like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I have not seen all of Agent Carter. I want to see more of it, though, but I have not gotten around to it. But everything that I've seen a good chunk of it, but not all of it. I really love. She does such a phenomenal job in this role. Because it's set more as a prequel, and because we're following a character sort of more directly tied into the MCU, even though Agent Coulson was in the MCU, for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I feel like this show just feels like it has more weight, especially since it does have a little bit of a payoff in Avengers Endgame. Not a huge one, but a little bit of one. I overall feel like this show feels more consequential than it ultimately ends up being, but I really love it. I love her performance. I love seeing the origins of S.H.I.E.L.D. Such a great show. I'm going to put it below Jessica Jones. I could see this being argued to be A tier, but I have a hard time justifying it being over Jessica Jones, even though I'm kind of taking it as a totality of Jessica Jones. And I know there's dips in Jessica Jones. I'm going to put Agent Carter as a B right under Jessica Jones. But again, like Jessica Jones, I could see it being pushed up higher, but that's where it's going to sit on this list. This brings us to Avengers Age of Ultron. So, like Iron Man 2, this is a movie that very much feels like a bridge movie in the MCU. Like, it's really trying to build up its own stuff. This is clearly like them wanting to do an Avengers movie, not feeling like it's time for Avengers Infinity War, but needing to do something nonetheless, to sort of have that big Avengers movie and keep that sort of idea of the team Avengers in mind. And I feel like I understand this movie being necessary on that front of showing like them be the Avengers together before we do something like Civil War, Infinity War, which sort of breaks them apart and shatters them a little bit. So you kind of need to have this movie, and I get that. But ultimately, this movie feels like it's trying to serve so many masters other than its own, other than trying to tell its own interesting story. Like this movie sets up, it sets up Infinity War, it sets up Civil War, it sets up Black Panther, it sets up Ragnarok, it sets up Vision. It's just ultimately doing so many things in this movie that are ultimately not just telling a good movie, that it feels frustrating. However, James Spader's Ultron, phenomenal. I think James Spader brings such a wonderful gravitas to that villain that makes it a lot of fun to watch him. The moment where they're all in Avengers Tower at the party, like everything with the party, and they're all getting drunk and trying to pick up Thor's hammer, and the little tease that pays off with Endgame with Steve and the hammer there, all really fun. So there are some good moments in here as well. There's also still that skeeviness with Joss Whedon that we talked about before with the treatment of Black Widow, especially in this movie. And so that's sort of in here as well, and the sort of like, oh look, I'm so upset that I can't have a kid sort of thing. The thing is better handled than the Black Widow movie proper. This is gonna get a C below a C below Defenders, above Luke Cage, because I feel like there's some fun moments in it, kind of like Defenders. No, you know what? Defenders just feels like it wastes a lot of my time. I'm going to put it above Defenders. It's a C above Defenders, because it doesn't waste my time as much as Defenders does. While I do kind of, and it also has the same character interaction stuff as Defenders, and the story is got more weight than Defenders does with its waste of Sigourney Weaver. So I'm going to give it a high C for Age of Ultron. Alrighty, here's where I'm probably going to be screwing up my order a little bit. I probably already screwed up some order somewhere in terms of release order, but let's do Ant-Man next. I love this movie. This movie, I feel like, does not get remembered as well. I think it's the action's some of the most creative in the MCU. The train stuff is really great. Paul Rudd is phenomenal. Yeah, the villain's a bit of a waste, but I kind of like them doing a heist movie within the MCU. I think that's kind of fun. I love the bit where like he battles Falcon up at the Avengers compound. That's always a good moment. This movie, I think, is just a lot of fun overall. I will give it a. I'm gonna give it. See, this is another one I could even put in A tier, but I'm going to give it a B. I'm going to put it above Agent Carter. I think Ant-Man is just a lot of fun and a really, really good time. I'm going to put it below Agent Carter. Agent Carter, I think, is overall stronger, but man, I could switch them around. Doctor Strange. So Doctor Strange is great. I love why am I blanking? Benedict Cumberbatch or Benedict Cumberbatch as an actor. I think he does a great job. I think the visuals in this movie are really, really wonderful. The end twist scene with the Dormammu is really, really clever. I think clever sort of subversion of sort of the big fight at the end of Marvel movie. So that's really enjoyable. However, such a waste of Mads Mikkelsen in this movie. Mads Mikkelsen honestly could headline his own Marvel movie. I love him as an actor, and he is wasted in this movie as a villain. It's so disappointing because I was like, I want him back in the MCU as a hero of some sort, not like this bland villain. And also the whitewashing in this movie, which is also kind of eh. Also the fact that the storyline is very much sort of reminiscent of the original Iron Man. It's kind of very similar, like arrogant dude kind of gets brought to task and ultimately learns to be a hero. So it's kind of the same arc there, but ultimately I think a lot of fun. So I'm going to give this one high. No, let's be bold. We'll give it a low A. We'll give it a low A. I could have put it above Jessica Jones as like the highest B, but we'll give it a low A. We'll give it a low A. It's in there. Okay, so let's jump off of that and go back to a TV show. Inhumans. I don't think this needs to be even a question. It's a D. It's a D. Such a bad show. I'm curious what this movie would have been if it had been made into the movie that they had intended it to be. And there's some stuff in here, like Anson Mount is at least interesting, being like showing that gravitas, not being able to talk. And I love Anson Mount so much over on Star Trek that I like, it's just nice to see him here. So there's some good stuff in here, just him particularly, but the villain's plan is just so like vilifying such an interesting idea of like, you know, wanting to topple this like aristocratic society and wanting to be more equitable, but he's ultimately like, I'm doing it for evil purposes, which kind of becomes a problem also in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And so, yeah, this show is just bad. Right from the first scene, it's rough. Again, Anson Mount's worthwhile. There's a couple other bits and pieces, but ultimately this is just a D, just a sad D. And no one likes a sad D. No one likes a sad D. Let's stay on TV shows for a minute and talk about Cloak and Dagger. Cloak and Dagger should be better than it is. I think it starts off strong. I actually really was intrigued by this idea of like a Romeo and Juliet sort of story told in the MCU, sort of class distinctions, even talking about racial issues as well within this. But ultimately the show just loses that thread. And also their powers are just interesting. I think their powers are interesting in the fact that they have to be close to each other. Like the whole concept of the show is fantastic. And there's moments of that. There's moments of that really shine in the show. But overall with Cloak and Dagger, my problem is it just becomes MCU superhero nonsense so quickly. It starts losing the thread of like what was interesting about it in the first place, that sort of, you know, two sides of two different worlds, racial issues, sort of discussing class stuff, and ultimately just becomes like bland superhero nonsense that's super not interesting, like them fighting big, strange, weird stuff. I don't even remember. To be honest, I watched every episode of this show, and I barely remember it because most of it just sort of was like my eyes glazed over. Even though conceptually the show is so cool, visually it was also the dagger stuff that she uses. Just really visually striking. The shadow stuff is really cool. But yeah, ultimately it just becomes bland and purposeless, despite it feeling like it could have been really meaningful ultimately. So I'm gonna put it at a C. Below, I'm gonna go below Luke Cage. I'm gonna put it below Luke. It's a below Iron Man. I'm gonna put it above Punisher. So it's a C. It's a C. It has moments of greatness that, you know, if it had really pushed on them, it could have put the show right in A, like clearly. But it just becomes so bland overall that I have to put it at a C, which is disappointing because it could have been great. And let's sort of round out these sort of like MCU shows that have no consequence in the MCU with Runaways. This one starts off a lot of fun. This is one that kind of weirdly suffers from the same Netflix problem in that the pacing is just way off, but it's not the amount of episodes. It's not like the story they're telling in a single season. It's just like they take so long to actually become Runaways. Like, I don't think they become Runaways until season 2, I believe, is where that goes, because I sort of binged this show. Again, this is one of those ones that kind of becomes bland when it could have had the most character. Like, look at that poster. Just that poster alone, if you can really kind of see with it kind of being see-through here, shows a lot of character for the show, and it does, but never capitalizes on it. So again, I'm going to put it at a C. I will probably put it... I'm going to put it right above Cloak and Dagger. You can go either way on either of those two. Cloak and Dagger, I feel like, wastes its potential more because it could have said something more weighty. But I think it does have a few moments of that. Whereas Runaways, I think, is slightly better overall, but ultimately doesn't have those weightier moments. So I feel like Runaways is better than Cloak and Dagger, but because it's more entertaining to watch. But Cloak and Dagger, I think, has a few more important moments, but ultimately it's arguable either way. Getting back to more interesting things, though, let's talk about Civil War. Another movie that I think a lot of people hold more in higher regard than I did when it first came out. Like, I liked Civil War, but I didn't love it. Since it has come out, though, I find Civil War to be the movie that I revisit the most, if I'm just, like, wanting to put something on in the MCU, because it's the one that just, like, I get a little taste of all the characters. I like the build-up of the conflict. It feels natural between Captain America and Tony, in terms of their ideology. I think the problem that I ultimately have with it is it, again, hinges on the Bucky stuff, which ultimately does pay off well in the movie, but for most of the movie's runtime, the very fact that, like, this whole conflict is starting over Bucky, and Iron Man does not really care about him until the final moments where it's revealed that Bucky killed his parents. That's when the movie kind of really hits an emotional high. But before then, it just feels like, oh my gosh, I do not care about the Bucky Steve thing, and that it's causing this whole bit. Like, I feel more between Steve and Tony in terms of their friendship than I do Steve and Bucky. And so ultimately, that gets very frustrating. The conflict on that level feels very forced. But the ideological battle is very interesting. The interactions between the characters are awesome, and I just enjoy returning to them and enjoy them. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that scene in Age of Ultron where they're all hanging out drinking, but an entire movie of that, of like interesting character interactions instead of them being like weirdly siloed in Age of Ultron. And so I feel like, oops, sorry if you're hearing that motorcycle there, but I feel like I'm going to give Civil War a B and put it right below Jessica Jones. No. You know what? No. I'm going to give it an A, and I'm putting Doctor Strange back down to a B because I was like, that was the thing that was hanging me. Doctor Strange is a B. Civil War is an A. Barely. Yeah, it's barely an A, but I'm really thinking about it, but it's an A. It's an A. Next up, we have Black Panther. This is another easy one. S tier. Villain, Killmonger, phenomenal. The world building with this movie is fantastic. It is such a celebration of that culture, of that world, and for like black folks in across the world, but especially in the United States. I think this movie was just so important on that level to really see black characters and black people represented and celebrated in such a fun way. And you could really see the love and care that was put into every aspect of this movie. There's some things that take it down. I think the final fight just becomes like a CGI mess towards the end there. But generally, overall, this movie is freaking fantastic. A lot of fun. Brings some actually really strong political ideas to the forefront and actually addresses them and really makes you think about them in a way that some other MCU movies start to get to, but really kind of bungle towards the end. I think of like The Winter Soldier to a degree, or Falcon and the Winter Soldier as well. Really anything with the Winter Soldier in the title has that problem. But Black Panther, I really just think it has a message and it says that message and it says it well and it says it strongly, and it feels very consequential. It's really kind of sad that we're not going to see another movie with Chadwick Boseman, but I am going to be excited to see more Black Panther movies, like Wakanda Forever and the other things that they're going to be doing with that. But yeah, S tier, not above Guardians of the Galaxy though for me, because Guardians of the Galaxy speaks to me personally as like who I am, but it's definitely S tier, Speaking of Guardians of the Galaxy though, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I already know where I'm going to put it. I'm going to put it at a low A. You know, I know some people would put it even higher, and I know I love Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. I think Volume 2, I really, really enjoy. I think there's some really strong stuff in it. I love the character interactions. Obviously, it's an A. I think what brings it lower and puts it at the lower end of the A's for me, and you could even argue it's a B, but I think what puts it at a high A is the character direction, the world building, the like really emotional, heavy moments. The visuals are phenomenal. The humor is well utilized, but still doesn't distract from the emotionality, which someone like James Gunn you would think would be more joke focused, but is not. He knows how to master telling strong characters with good humor that doesn't distract from the characters and the character work and the story being told. So really great job on James Gunn there. I feel like this movie is a little bit too bloated, a little bit too long, and drags a bit in the middle for me. So I think that's what puts it a little bit lower. But the moments like Rocket Raccoon's whole arc in this, Yondu stuff in this, Star-Lord stuff in this, fantastic movie overall. Nebula gets some great stuff in here as well. And Drax and Gamora get some decent moments too. But I think I think this movie is really, really great. But a small step down from the first Guardians for me. Then we have Spider-Man Homecoming with its awful poster. That poster is just god-awful. But this movie's a lot of fun. I really enjoy Spider-Man Homecoming. It is the Spider-Man movie that I like to go back to just enjoy and have fun with. If I want to sit down and enjoy a movie, I'll probably put on some of the Sam Raimi stuff like Spider-Man or Spider-Man 2. But if I'm just looking for just a fun romp, this is the Spider-Man movie that I always put on. I think oh my god. Why am I blanking on his name? Oh my god, I hate myself. Tom Holland, Jesus. I really enjoy Tom Holland's Peter Parker. Also, the villain of this piece is fantastic. Michael Keaton's Vulture is really, really good. His motivation is kind of bland, like, I'm angry at Tony Stark again, and that sort of thing. But I like that he feels relatable and reasonable. His plan is not ending the world, so the stakes feel lower, and that actually makes the movie more interesting. I think what makes this movie a little bit lower, and I also love the stuff between Spider-Man and Tony as well, but I think what puts this lower is I feel like it kind of forgets, and this is more indicative in Far From Home, though, but it kind of forgets a little bit of what makes Peter Parker Peter Parker. This movie, I think, still gets it, but Peter Parker, what makes Spider-Man interesting is the low-level hero. He is the low-level guy, and I like that this movie has lower stakes, but still the fact that it's dealing with, like, Avengers stuff and Tony Stark being here and Peter getting that, like, high-tech Spider-Man suit, I think kind of undoes a lot of what makes Spider-Man unique. And so I feel like, this movie doesn't lose that as much. Far From Home is a much more egregious example of that. So I'm going to put this movie as a high B. High B. No. Low A. It's a low A for me. I love it. It's a lot of fun. But I think, no, B. B. It's B. Sorry, indecisive. It's a B. But those are the reasons. But this brings us to Thor Ragnarok. This movie, I love this movie. On rewatching this movie gets everything that I love about Chris Hemsworth. I really enjoy his energy. It really is just a lot of fun in the world. Jeff Goldblum is hilarious as the villain. The world is so fun and vibrant in it. The only reason that I would put this lower is that everything with Hela in this movie is interesting and intriguing, and I like the imperialism aspect of thinking about Asgard in that way. I think that's a great utilization of her, but she feels so ancillary to what is actually happening within this movie. Like, I feel like clearly the people wanted to do the Planet Hulk storyline, wanted to have Chris Hemsworth on this planet with Jeff Goldblum, but felt like they had an obligation to do the Ragnarok storyline. And so she just feels like she's just so sidelined off to the side for most of this. A waste of Karl Urban, who is fun in the movie, but just, again, feels like a waste of an actor that I really would have loved to see more of in the MCU, kind of like Mads Mikkelsen. Because Karl Urban is so freaking phenomenal as an actor, that I'm gonna have to put this movie as a B. Everything else besides the Hela stuff, S tier. Could have put this in an S, but because Hela is so ancillary, even though the things that her character has to say about Asgard are interesting, I think feels like so needless to what this movie wanted to do, and it feels so separate from what this wanted to do that it pushes it down, and that kills me. It kills me to put it here. But I just feel the obligations that this movie had to the MCU, that much more. And there's very clear Taika Waititi did not want to, or was not as concerned with it as the rest of the movie. And I think that pushes it down, even though both sides are interesting, just one's clearly less interesting. Though I am excited to see, with Thor Love and Thunder. I think that'll be great with Taika Waititi kind of unshackled from the burdens of dealing with other MCU stuff. I think that'll make it a much more clearer movie. I know it kills me. I know that'll be controversial. I could have given this movie an S, but I have to put it at a B, given its structural issues. This brings us, though, to Avengers Infinity War. Such a fun movie. This was the build-up, the hype that we always wanted. I love all the character interactions. There's some really great moments. However, I feel like, going back to rewatch it, some of the action is a little bit more bland for me. There's some moments that I'm just like, oh, that's cool, but not as interesting as it could be. Some little bit of interactions here and there. So I'm going to put this one, controversially, as a B movie. Above Doctor Strange, but below Homecoming. I love this movie. It's a lot of fun. It definitely it's a movie to, you should see in theaters. It was such an event. But ultimately I feel like it doesn't hold up as much on the rewatches for me, as the rest of them. So I'm going to put Infinity War in the B tier, but it's a really solid B. Like a solid, it would, honestly, it's a really, really, really rewatchable B, but a B nonetheless for me. Which brings us to Ant-Man and the Wasp. This is another fun movie. I think this one gets a little bit underrated. Oh, we'll look at that jumping down there. This movie is very underrated. I think the villain is not as strong as she could be. Visually, Ghost is cool looking, but I think there's some really fun moments in here. I love the sort of jumping around with the making things bigger and larger. But ultimately, the problem that I have with Ant-Man and the Wasp, despite the stuff that I like about it, is that it doesn't feel as creative as the first Ant-Man first Ant-Man movie. There's some cool moments. Giant Ant-Man, great. But I feel like you could do so much more creative stuff with Ant-Man and the Wasp that the movie ultimately does, that I'm kind of was left a little bit disappointed. I'm like, I liked this movie. It's enjoyable. I had a good time with it. But I wish they had done more. And also the very fact, like, I remember, like, all the cool bits were in the trailer for this movie, and so when I saw it in the movie, I was like, oh, yeah, I already saw it. So that was a little bit of disappointment. Not the movie's fault, the sort of the marketing machine's fault, but nonetheless affected my enjoyment of the movie. So I like Ant-Man and the Wasp. I think it is a solid movie, but I don't think it's as creative as I really had hoped it was going to be. So I'm going to put it as a B. I'm going to put it below Winter Soldier, but above Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. I think it's just a solid B that ultimately is disappointing, but I still like nonetheless. But I am excited for Ant-Man Quantumania coming up, because I think that'll be a better usage of it, hopefully. Then we have Captain Marvel. Oh, I'm going to get in trouble for this one, I feel like, but this is a C movie. It is a C movie. It is so... I like Brie Larson's Captain Marvel, but I don't think she has as much charisma as I would have liked her to have. Like, I think she's a great actress. I think Brie Larson, when she has moments, I think she is wonderful, but I really feel like they do a disservice to her in this movie of, like, trying to bottle her up. Like, I know that's part of her arc, that she's supposed to be strong and stoic, and she can show more emotion. That is her arc as a character, but I ultimately just make it feel like it underutilizes what Brie Larson can do and her charisma that she clearly has. If you watch other movies, like, I think it's like Unicorn Store, the movie that she directed, and some other things that she's done, Brie Larson has some fantastic charisma that is just not shown in her character with Carl Danvers. The movie also just has this performative feminism aspects to it that's like, I'm just a girl. Really trying to capitalize on, like, look, we have a female superhero. Like, I remember the trailer saying her and then opening up a hero. It was just so like, yeah, look, we have our female movie. And it was just, it felt like it was really just doing that. And it's like, with a company like Disney, you can taste the performative nature of their activism, without really ever backing it up with anything real and substantive. And that's what this movie feels like. There's some good moments in it. I like the villain. I like the moment where she, like, punches him in the face, like, I don't have to prove anything to you. That felt like it was actually showing, like, that arc and what it means to be sort of a movie that talks about women and women's issues. That moment felt that. Everything else about that felt performative. The storyline is kind of bland. I really like the surprise with the Skrulls. That was a great twist. Ben Mendelsohn as the sort of Skrull leader is great, and I'm excited to see him come back in future projects, supposedly, as well as he did in Far From Home for brief moments. So I think the Skrulls were great, but ultimately it's just a C movie. It's just a C movie. I'm going to put it below... I'm going to put it above Runaways, below Iron Man 2. I think that's a good place for it. No, goes above Iron Man 2. We're going to put it above Iron Man 2. Now we're getting near the end here with Avengers End Game. This movie... Oh, this is hard. It's an upper crust for me. I know other people like Infinity War better than people like Endgame, but Endgame feels like it was a good ending to these characters, had such wonderful character moments, had the guts to have a opening hour of the movie that was slow and methodical and just kind of depressing in a way that's like, wow, you really feel the weight of their loss at the beginning of the movie when they go and find Thanos, but also at the end of Infinity War. You feel it. And everything else is just such a celebration of everything that the MCU has been. The moments are phenomenal. Seeing this movie in a theater was an experience that I will never I don't think I'll ever be able to recapture again in a theater. Because the moment where, like, Steve picks up the hammer, just all those moments, it was so cool to experience with the crowd. It was just a cultural moment that this movie manages to capture and ultimately feel satisfying in that. Great movie, overall. Again, I know people feel like the more propulsive nature of Infinity War is more to their style. Endgame is very much just a movie that I love on every level. So this is S tier for me as well. Very much S tier. Below Black Panther, below Guardians of the Galaxy, but definitely S tier. All right, and rounding out Phase 3, we have Far From Home. This is another B movie. This is a movie that I feel like very much got away. Like, Homecoming had elements of this. Far From Home really just, I think, misunderstands Spider-Man. Now, there's a lot to love here. There's a good time. Like, I really think Jake Gyllenhaal's performance as Mysterio's wonderful. I really enjoy everything he does with him. His motivation's weak. Again, it's like another Tony Stark person who has a grudge against Tony Stark villain, and it's really disappointing seeing that be a villain for a Spider-Man movie. And again, it just does a disservice to Spider-Man by putting him as like the Iron Man like substitute, when he really should be much more down to earth guy. And it really just feels like this movie was too big for his character and sort of made me lose what I like about Spider-Man. And that ultimately just frustrates me overall. A lot of and then the fights in this and the big action are just so bland and CGI based that I was just so bored by it in a lot of times. Tom Holland does a wonderful job. I love MJ in this movie as well. So there's great character moments throughout this. But ultimately I just think completely misunderstands Spider-Man. So this is a low B for me. I think even under Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. it's a low B. Like, it's not a C bad. It's not like awful, but it's low. It's low for me. Actually, you know what? I'm going to be bold. It's a C. I'm going to put it as a C. But this brings us to Phase 4 with WandaVision. WandaVision is a show that I really, really loved. I thought it was so clever, doing something new. And this show showed me that the MCU is willing to, after Endgame, be like, we are going to try something new. We are going to do something different. It's not going to be the same old Marvel with this. Also makes the movies feel, the Disney Plus TV shows feel like they have weight, like they have meaning, like they're doing something cool in this world. It had some cool stuff to say about grief and trauma, was trying something new structurally, was really giving a focus to characters in the MCU had not been given a focus to before, has some creeping dread moments, some really interesting surprises. That all being said, the ending is deeply disappointing. Agatha Harkness, I think, is so out of left field and purposeless and needless in this movie. You don't need her. It should have just been Wanda was the villain all along. I hate the ending of this show so much. The more I think about it, there are moments that I like about it, like Vision's Ship of Theseus discussion. I thought was really cool, but ultimately the ending is just so bungled, and I feel like gets across the wrong message about grief and pain and how to handle that and PTSD, and accountability as well. That I think that this show, I should say, sets up interesting stuff, but doesn't pay off some of its more interesting elements that it had from earlier on. So this is going to get another B for me. I know the B tier is sort of filling up here, but I feel like this just has to be a B. The question is, where does it sit? And I feel like it sits below Ant-Man. Yeah, I feel like it sits below below Iron Man 3, above Thor. I feel like that's where it sits, because I really do appreciate its boldness. I really appreciate its boldness, but the ending, no. You know what? Boldness gets some points for me. It's gonna go between Agent Carter and Ant-Man. That's where it's gonna sit. Because I think the boldness points. I really feel like the ending really left a sour taste in my mouth, but I have to appreciate everything that I loved before that ending, so I have to put it there. Hard. Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Oh, I'm just going to put that at a C, high C. This show felt like it was trying to do something similar to Black Panther, in that it was trying to say something meaningful with its message, to try and say something meaningful about the world. And I really appreciated it for that. I was really enjoying it for that. But this show, despite being so short, despite being only 6 episodes, feels like it takes way too long. This should have just been a 2-hour movie, I feel like. Even though I know probably, Falcon and Winter Soldier may not have sold well. I think it might have, but I understand why they put it as a sort of Disney Plus show in terms of like the attention that was drawn to it. But I really feel like it would have been better served as a 2-hour movie as opposed to a 6-hour thing. Ultimately, also, I feel like it just bungles its messaging with some really problematic stuff on multiple levels that I've done a whole video on, but other people have discussed on. I think Feminist Frequency, the podcast, did a great discussion on some of the issues with this show overall in terms of its representation of, Black communities and Black issues. I think it tried to reach for the stars and really try to have that messaging, but I don't think was as powerful as something like, say, the recent Watchmen series was. that I think really had a much stronger message to say. Again, I'm white, so take my thoughts with a grain of salt on that end of things, but for me, I think it bungled some stuff. I also think it bungled the villains terribly. The Flag Smashers could have been much more interesting, but just ultimately vilified so much. It was sort of the same problem that we talked about earlier on this list with, I forget the movie that we were talking about, but it's a very similar problem. So, yeah, it's a C. It's a C for me. But this brings us to Black Widow, the most recently released film. Black Widow, I liked. It is solidly a B movie. Should have come out earlier. It doesn't feel as performative as like Captain Marvel does, and being like leveraged as I look at our Marvel movie, look at our female-led movie. I feel like it's only made because people were clamoring for a female-led Black Widow movie for forever. So you can feel the strings in terms of why it got made now instead of when it should have been made, which is between Civil War and Infinity War. That's when this movie should have come out. That's when it would have been relevant and would have felt like it mattered and had consequence. Ultimately, this movie feels like it just should have come out then, and feels like it's just such an afterthought now in its place in the MCU. So that being said, everything within the movie I really enjoyed. I think it's a lot of fun. I think there's problems with it. The villain's kind of bland. I think there's some issues. I did a whole review of it recently, so I won't go too far into it. So I feel like this movie is solid and good. It has its own problems. I feel like I have issues more with its place in the context of the MCU and when it came out. But within and of itself, I think it's a solid movie. It's kind of like one of those, like, I enjoy it, don't love it, but, you know, I'll put it on and have a fun time with it. So, I'm going to put it above Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. here, and just sort of say, good, not great. You know, actually, no, we'll bump it up. Goes below Iron Man. It's right there. It's like smack dab in the middle of the MCU. Just like right there. It's like, it's good. Not great, but good. And it's exactly that. Which brings us finally to Loki, the most recent release. This is easy for me. S tier above Endgame. I loved Loki. I did a whole video on it. I've done all those reviews on it. This show is so phenomenal. One of my favorite characters in the MCU, focused on him. I love the story of the TVA. I love the themes of the show about controlling your own destiny. What does it mean to have free will? I think the ending of this was so bold and brash in terms of being like something smaller scale in terms of just what it shows on screen was just a philosophy debate, which is always my favorite things. If every show ends on a philosophy debate, I'm happy with that. I mean, it shows that my favorite part of the WandaVision finale was the Vision philosophy debate. So that sort of stuff. Tom Hiddleston just does a great performance. But also the show, while feeling more low key, no pun intended, feels like it has stakes and meaning in the MCU. Whether that will actually ultimately pay off going forward, who knows? We will see in the next few movies in the next few over the next few years. But in and of itself, where season 1 ended, really made us feel like it had consequence, it had meaning. The story is fantastic, the character's fantastic. I love pretty much everything about the show. There's quibbles and quabbles that I can make here and there with some stuff, but overall, and you could even talk about some stuff that I talked about in my other video about its LGBTQ representation and sort of the issues therein, and in terms of Loki's gender fluidity, biphobia accusations leveled at this show, things like that. I personally also like the Sylvie Loki relationship as well, though I know people have issues with it. Is like on an incest level, which I don't see. It's much more like masturbation. But anyways, I love this show. I thought it was fantastic. It was personally one of my favorite projects in the MCU. It's clear that it's an S rank. So yeah, I think below Black Panther, but I think it's a solid S tier. So I think looking at this list, and actually kind of nice that my image kind of fits perfectly right within this little corner here. But yeah, I'm looking it over, trying to see if there's anything that I would disagree with here. I don't think so. I think everything on this list is accurate to what I feel about it. So yeah, this is my official MCU tier ranking list. What do you think? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. I'm sure I said something controversial that got you all angry or pissed off. But of course, this is just my ranking. I would love to hear your thoughts as well. And yeah, if you disagree with me, that's awesome. Totally cool. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below about that. So yeah, let's have some fun. Let me know your rankings, how you would put everything in. Other than that, I just want to say thank you for enjoying my content, enjoying my channel. I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy.